Okay, Malinowski's Curious Prophecy. The analogous relationship between Oedipal victories and the primal deed brings us to our next subject. Earlier in this series, I quoted Malinowski's curious prediction that the Oedipus complex would become extinct in proportion to the emasculation of the patriarchal father. As he put it, quote, "Psychoanalysis cannot hope, I think, to preserve its Oedipus complex for future generations, who will only know a weak and henpecked father. For him, the children will feel indulgent pity rather than hatred and fear," end quote. Originally, my reason for quoting this abysmal forecast for the Western father of patriarchy was to clarify that Malinowski had never viewed the Trobriand matrilineal complex of his thesis as a mere subtype within Oedipal theory, some kind of different Oedipus complex. Malinowski's actual view on this is important for the contemporary discourse. It's important to understand it because a misrepresentation of his thesis precisely to this effect arose in anthropology and psychoanalysis and continues to show up in various forms in the present literature and continues to be a source of confusion. A consequence of this confusion, perhaps the major consequence for the purposes of this subject that we're discussing, is that it obscured the critical difference in Freudian theory between what causes the Oedipus complex on the one hand and what complicates its resolution on the other. For this reason, a brief look at the confusion over Malinowski's thesis is necessary before we address the more important question of what actually causes the Oedipus complex. Now, around the time of the closely coinciding deaths of Freud, Malinowski, and Boas, the three patriarchs, Freud in 1939 and both the latter in 1942, right at the beginning of World War II and right into the height of it, or at least the first phase. This idea that Malinowski had argued for a type of Oedipus complex became more common among leading figures in both disciplines. To repeat only one of the several examples I gave before in a previous part, Fenichel, in his influential psychoanalytic theory of the neuroses, attributed to Malinowski the idea that, quote, "societies with family configurations different from our own actually have different Oedipus complexes." This use of Oedipal terminology to describe Malinowski's own critique of Oedipal theory was an ironic development, I would argue, to say the least. The so-called different Oedipus complex that Fenichel and others had in mind, the matrilineal complex, represented a radical redefinition of Oedipal theory, a rejection of it, at least from the full Freudian sense of that theory. Not only was it supposed to have proven that the Oedipus complex was not universal, but it had also redefined it as a pathological symptom or syndrome. According to Malinowski, the Oedipus complex wasn't a normal developmental conflict in need of resolution in the course of development, but a sickness in need of a cure, a pathology in need of a cure. Yet the same thesis, accepted as valid by many in both disciplines, was now being referred to as though it had confirmed a universal Oedipal structure of which it was merely a type, a matrilineal Oedipus complex. Arguably, this ironic condensation of terms was just another example of the decoupling or watering down of Oedipal concepts that we've already seen. On the other hand, On the other hand, the fact that it was concurrent with the deaths of Freud, Boas, and Malinowski, just as their grieving followers had become wartime allies, also suggests that a wish for some mediating function in the bitter controversy may have begun to surface. In this case, the construct of a matrilineal Oedipus complex would also have functioned in a manner similar to the original totemic object, as a compromise formation, forged out of necessity on behalf of an otherwise warring band of siblings in a time of ambivalent mourning and at a time of great danger, existential danger. From the beginning, Malinowski himself may have contributed to the confusion, though, when he claimed that his thesis had confirmed, quote, the main tenet of Freudian psychology, end quote. But this had nothing to do with the Oedipus complex, per se. It simply meant that he had, quote, established a deep correlation between the type of society and the nuclear complex found there, end quote. And given the nature of Malinowski's critique, this certainly did Freud no favors. It amounted to a rhetorical means of undoing Oedipal theory with faint praise. Aside from the fact that Freud never agreed with such a watered-down definition of his main psychological tenet, the essential point remained that the Oedipus complex was supposed to be universal, and Malinowski had found no such complex in the Trobriand Islands. On the central question of the universality of the Freudian Oedipus complex, Malinowski's position could not have been clearer. The Trobriand complex was not a different type of Oedipus complex. It was a different type of nuclear complex. Therefore, the Oedipus complex could not be universal. His entire argument relied explicitly on the assertion that the nuclear complex of Trobriand society was so, quote, entirely different in its genesis and its character from the Oedipus complex, end quote. In fact, Malinowski's prediction of an end to the Oedipus complex and Western patriarchy itself with the arrival of a weak and henpecked father wouldn't have made any sense otherwise. With all these considerations in mind, let's now return to Malinowski's prediction that the Oedipus complex would become extinct with the rise of that weak and henpecked father. As I've said, this idea obscured the distinction between what causes the Oedipus complex and what interferes with its resolution. Malinowski's prediction relied on the premise that the father's power, or more accurately the pathological abuse of it, causes the Oedipus complex. It assumed that in the absence of oppressive patriarchal authority, the son's hostile emotions toward the father, associated with sexual rivalry for the mother's love, would not arise. This premise was a reflection of Malinowski's idiosyncratic rendering of Freudian Oedipal theory. And on closer scrutiny, the flaw in the logic of it really becomes easy to recognize. It was equivalent to saying that someone competing for sexual love could feel no hostility toward a rival, so long as the rival posed no physical threat. This allowed for no role whatsoever for narcissistic rage or anger directed toward objects perceived as potential obstacles to love and sexual attachment. The only relevant ideological factor in Malinowski's formula, and all of those that follow this sort of logic of Malinowski's into the present literature, the only ideological factor in it is oppressive paternal hostility. This was the same problem that Freud had identified in his critique of the Adlerian view of life, namely that it was a theory founded, quote, founded exclusively on the aggressive instinct, end quote. As Freud eloquently put it, there is no room in it for love, end quote. Accordingly, Malinowski's critique relied, and again, those that follow him continue to rely, on portrayals of the Western-type father and the non-Western father, in Malinowski's case, the Trobriand father, that from a contemporary perspective appear transparently villainized and romanticized, respectively. Malinowski's representation of the patriarchal father was so one-dimensionally hostile and aggressive, in fact, so much like the tyrannical primal father in Totem and Taboo, that one can appreciate why Malinowski would have hoped for his quick extermination or extinction as soon as possible. Ironically enough, the Viennese father of little Hans, Freud's exemplary case of child phobia in Totem and Taboo, bore a closer resemblance to the Trobriand all-loving father depicted by Malinowski. Spiro documented the problem with these exaggerated representations and explained them in terms of Malinowski's effort to, quote, reinforce his polemical aim of proving that the hostility of the Western son is to be explained by the father's oppressive authority, end quote, rather than by the son's sexual rivalry with the father for the mother's sole affections. Psychoanalysts influenced by Marxist theory, such as Reich in The Mass Psychology of Fascism, 1933, and The Sexual Revolution, 1936, or later, Guattari, if I'm pronouncing his name right, in Anti-Oedipus, took up and amplified the more ideological and sociopolitical implications of Malinowski's thesis of pathological patriarchy. Perhaps the most controversial excuse me, and tragic of these was Wilhelm Reich, who eventually pushed these elements to frankly psychotic extremes. In spite of the psychotic element in Reich's ideological views, however, his ultra-Malinowskian critique of patriarchy gained a great deal of followers, and his argument continues to show up in the current literature in different forms. Right up until the end, Reich had many disciples, including medical doctors and scientists, end quote. This was from Chassagoy, Smergel, and Grunberger. Again, I hope I'm pronouncing their names correctly. Reich became fascinated with Malinowski's idealized portrayal of Trobriand sexuality and his ideas on patriarchy, repression, and totalitarianism. With his amalgam of Freudian and Marxist theories, Reich constructed a more explicitly political version of Malinowski's prediction of an extinct Oedipus complex. Quote, the Oedipus complex must disappear in a socialist society because its social basis, the patriarchal family, will itself disappear, having lost its raison d'etre, end quote. Reich seized upon Freud's earlier theory that anxiety results simply from undischarged quantities of libido and proceeded to reduce all mental and physical illness to a single cause, sexual stasis. Again, that was Chassagoy, Smergel, and Grunberger. The mentally ill person is simply, quote, constrained by social prohibitions and is unable to abandon himself to orgasm to discharge sexual energy, end quote. Reich further insisted that, quote, and this is Reich himself, the repression of genital tendencies is what provokes the eruption of brutality in history, end quote. Chasseguay, Smergel, and Grunberger describe this overriding theme in Reich's writings. Quote, in all of Reich's work, we have a universal evil, sexual stasis, which is responsible for cancer, schizophrenia, and fascism. And its obverse in a universal panacea, orgasm, end quote. Now, probably it would be more accurate to say that patriarchy was the real evil for Reich and his followers, and that sexual stasis was merely its effect. As with Malinowski, the symptom may have been a sexual one, but the real problem was oppressive paternal authority, according to the argument. Exactly as Fromm and others would claim, along with Reich maintained that the Oedipus complex was only, quote, a result of the sexual restrictions imposed on the child by society. Yet wholly unconscious of what they're doing, the parents carry out the intentions of authoritarian society, end quote. So just remove any parental coercion of the child and you won't have an Oedipus complex. A major weakness of this argument for pathological patriarchy as the cause of the Oedipus complex is that it allows for no contribution whatsoever from normal maturation and development to a child's aggression, sexual competition, and ambivalent trends in the nuclear relationships. In one form or other, or any relationship actually for that matter, that radiate out from the nuclear relations of a child's, the nuclear relationships the child has in the family growing up. In one form or other, these all reflect a perversion of power structured according to external forces, encoded in repressive institutions, and implemented by pathological parenting. This argument is totally inconsistent with the abundant examples of instinctually driven dominance hierarchies, examples of sexual competition and bisexual behavior among all of our closest primate relatives. Are we to understand that the instinctual sources of these behaviors were simply erased with human evolution? The common thread that runs from Malinowski through Reich to later publications like Anti-Oedipus and into the contemporary psychoanalytic critiques is the claim that if the Oedipus complex is simply the consequence of culture and oppressive power, then the parents and Freudian psychoanalysts who reproduce Western society itself are the agents of that pathology. There are ever new examples within psychoanalysis of this old thesis. Here's a recent one. Quote, there is little doubt that the Oedipus complex is culture-specific and essentially a pathological outcome of a male-dominated, class-structured society. The destructive competition with other men produces distant, uncooperative, possibly non-constructive relationships and leads to erotic compulsions that prevent stable, intimate, sexually satisfying marriages alongside intimate, contextualized relationships with other women. These authors essentially paraphrase Malinowski's original conclusion and write that the Oedipus complex, quote, is not built into the collective mind but is found only under specific historical circumstances, such as societies with patriarchal authorization structures and competition for wealth that stimulate rivalry and hostility. And repeating Reich's objects of blame, the authors insist that parents, quote, as agents of such a social order who harbor hostile and erotic feelings for their children, bring the Oedipus complex into being where it may not exist, end quote. Specifically missing from this thesis is the Freudian complemental series. which includes both environmental and innate contributions in the etiology of aggression and sexual competition in the nuclear triangle. Also, for the same reason, it eliminates the weighing of both endogenous and exogenous contributions to bisexual conflicts and ambivalence in human psychosexuality in the course of development. These must all be pathological symptoms of oppressive power relations. Reich was explicit about this, maintaining that, quote, ambivalence in the sense of coexisting relations or reactions of love and hatred is not a biological but a socially conditioned fact. Freud would say it's both. By definition, this argument also pathologizes the complete Oedipus complex with its complementary heterosexual and homosexual dimensions. All of these essential Freudian concepts are simply eliminated and replaced with the same old Malinowskian ideological equation of external patriarchal oppression. So Freud on utopia. Freud was clear about his assessment of a utopian dimension to these socio-political critiques of Oedipal theory. This particular aspect of the polemic, namely the relation of individual psychology to power and political institutions, was always a part of the debates within and between both anthropology and psychoanalysis over the Oedipus complex. Within psychoanalytic circles alone, the relation of theoretical to political differences was complex. On the one hand, Fenchel, himself a Marxist, disagreed with neo-Freudians like Gardner, Fromm, and Horney, who insisted that Oedipal theory represented a rigid biological determinism that worked against the hope for a malleable human nature and perfectible society. Unlike Fenchel, the neo-Freudians insisted that, quote, the insight into the formative power of social forces upon individual minds, end quote, required changes in Freud's theory of instincts. That was Fenchel. On the other hand, Fenchel's ideological perspective, while less revolutionary than Reich's, required a level of optimism for humanity that Freud considered to be unrealistic, utopian. Fenchel believed that war's misery and neurosis, quote unquote, could one day be fully eliminated with, quote, a more reasonable and less contradictory regulation of social relations, end quote. Freud was more pessimistic about the benefits of state-regulated social relations and the future of mankind, an attitude which he explained in his correspondence with Albert Einstein, published in Why War in 1933. This following passage is particularly relevant to our subject because while Malinowski is addressing the critiques of his anthropological theory, implicitly he's referring to Malinowski's matrilineal thesis and Malinowski's Trobriand study. Quote, there is no use in trying to get rid of men's aggressive inclinations, Freud says. We are told that in certain happy regions of the earth, where nature provides in abundance everything that man requires, there are races whose life is passed in tranquility and who know neither coercion or aggression. I can scarcely believe it, and I should be glad to hear more of these fortunate beings. The Russian communists, too, hope to be able to cause human aggressiveness to disappear by guaranteeing the satisfaction of all material needs and by establishing equality in other respects among all members of the community. That, in my opinion, is an illusion, end quote. Now, what really causes the Oedipus complex? And infant dependency and precocious genitality. Apart from its utopian implications, perhaps the greatest weakness of the pathological patriarchy critique is that it fails to account for what is possibly one of the most significant and underappreciated features of human evolutionary biology, one which was always at the heart of Freud's Oedipal theory. The likely consequences of this feature for individual psychology and human society go virtually unnoticed in critiques of Oedipal theory in spite of their central role in the development of that theory by Freud. Specifically, Freud maintained that what sets the central Oedipal complex in motion is neither exclusively externally motivated, nor is it primarily aggression, paternal or otherwise. Rather, it's the prolonged duration of childhood helplessness and dependency, as this gradually becomes inflected through the prism of the distinctly precocious sexual maturation that characterizes human species, our species in particular. Homo sapiens in particular, I mean. In Freud's own words, quote, "The Oedipus complex is the psychical correlate of two fundamental biological facts: the long period of the human child's dependence and the remarkable way in which its sexual life reaches a first climax in the 3rd to 5th years of life," end quote. To better understand this feature of Freud's anthropological thinking, which has been underappreciated, we can turn to Gezer Roheim, the first psychoanalyst, anthropologist, and arguably the most eloquent interpreter of this aspect of Freudian theory. Roheim elaborated on the congruence between Freud's formulations and the fetalization theory of Dutch anatomist Louis Bolk. Roheim quotes Bolk here. And Bolk is, I think, doing his research in the first couple decades. This is probably from 1920s. Quote, "There is no mammal that grows so slowly as man, and not one in which the full development is attained at such a long interval after birth. What is the essential in man as an organism? The obvious answer is the slow progress of his life's course. This slow tempo is the result of a retardation that has gradually come about in the course of the ages," end quote, or the course of evolution. In the course of hominin evolution, individual physical development has been marked by a progressive retardation or slowing of its rate. Following Roheim's description of this, humans in particular achieve physical maturation, quote, "far more slowly than any other mammal. Most mammals are mature at 1 year or less. A chimpanzee is mature at about 7 years, a human being at about 15 or more. Though growth is not complete until over 20 years in a human, and the skull sutures remain open until nearly 30 so that the brain can still grow," end quote. The maturation being referred to here, the somatic or ego maturation being referred to here would include that of the ego of Freudian structural theory and all of what Hartman referred to as inborn ego apparatuses and the structures of the conflict-free sphere of the ego, such as perception, motility, memory, and the physical structures of the body on which they depend. Hartman, Chris, and Lowenstein underscored the importance of Roheim's observations on the significance of the retarded development of these structures in humans. Quote, "It implies the idea not only of the unique role of the love object in human development, but also the extent to which the influence of this object determines later behavior," end quote. A corollary of this evolutionary slowing of somatic development, or neoteny, is the progressive fetalization of adult human features relative to our primate relatives and our hominin ancestors. According to Roheim, quote, human beings have conserved traits in the anatomical structure which makes them comparable to juvenile or fetal anthropoids, end quote. As a result, quote, we are much more like baby monkeys than adult ones, end quote. This remarkable fact that Roheim is referring to, based on Volk and Freud, can be seen in adult human features such as flattened face, upright posture, roundness of the skull, and brain size relative to the body, all of which more closely resemble those of the infant chimpanzee, who will eventually outgrow them. We never do. Roheim's synthesis shows that Freud's observations on the evolutionary significance of this delayed development remains perfectly consistent with contemporary evolutionary biology. Stephen Jay Gould referred to this pedomorphic theory of human origins, whereby humans evolved by retaining the juvenile features of our ancestors, end quote. He judged that this neotness, slowing down of human development, and the corollary retention of juvenile traits, quote, has been probably the major determinant of human evolution, end quote. The selective advantage of this process is evident in the fact that it allowed for the retention into later development of the rapid brain growth rates of the fetus, longer learning and socialization, greater complexity in social behavior, and more adaptive flexibility due to less over-specialized traits. Now, the particular relevance of this to the Oedipus complex becomes clearer when we compare the slowed rate of ego development in humans to our separate rate of sexual drive development. Over the course of human evolution, the rates of these two maturational or developmental lines have become ever more decoupled, divergent, and asynchronous. The final adult growth of the ego lags far behind its sexual drive counterparts. Whereas in general, among most species, sexual development is synchronous with completed physical growth, this is not the case for humans. In Roheim's description, quote, the incidence of the sexual impulse is premature. Man is not only slowed down when compared to the animal world, but presents a disharmony in his own rate of development, end quote. The consequence of this is that, quote, within the frame of our general retardation, our sexuality is relatively precocious, end quote. Roheim also observed that the, quote, enormous discrepancy in the age of sexual maturity and full growth is striking when we compare man to other mammals, end quote. This also holds true even for our closest primate relatives, who in turn display the same asynchrony more so than all other mammals except humans. A remarkable example of this precocious genitality in another primate can be seen among the bonobo chimpanzees, a species possibly most similar to our pre-human ancestors. Among the bonobos, genital arousal and stimulation in a variety of modes is utilized nearly indiscriminately, including by juveniles and between the young and adults, as a means of modulating aggression, dissipating conflicts, food bartering, and other social purposes. Though not as great as in humans, the asynchronous relationship between sexual development and full physical growth is still quite marked. Quote, wild females, this is the bonobos, wild females give birth for the first time at 13 or 14 years of age, becoming full grown by about 15, end quote. That's from DeWall, 2006. Roheim elaborated on Freud's view of the significance of this asynchrony for object relations in childhood, noting that, quote, since genital libido is present at the time when the child is still dependent, the prima facie sex object must be the mother, end quote. Intrapsychic conflicts result from this mismatch between the child's object-related libidinal fantasies and the ability to fully satisfy them in reality. Depending on a multitude of potentially ameliorating or exacerbating internal and external factors, again in accordance with Freud's complemental series, these conflicts can result or might result in nothing more than the stage-typical transient nightmares and fears of monsters under the bed, typical for an Oedipal child. Conversely, the conflicts can develop into paralyzing and unresolvable symptoms, such as chronic phobias or crippling inhibitions later in adult relationships. Along with the evolution of this asynchronous differentiation between ego and id, humans therefore have co-evolved psychological mechanisms of defense. The mechanisms of defense of ego psychology, such as projection, repression, sublimation, introjection, symbolization, in order to protect the immature ego from being overwhelmed by the precocious drives while the child is still dependent on the mothering figure, or mothering figures. According to Roheim, quote, the psyche has to evolve various mechanisms to repress or project or transform the sexual impulse, end quote. Of course, that would apply as well to the aggressive impulse. Okay, social implications of all of this. I've followed Roheim extensively here in order to clarify Freud's underappreciated formulation that, quote, to repeat it, the Oedipus complex is the psychical correlate of two fundamental biological facts: the long period of the human child's dependence and the remarkable way in which its sexual life reaches a first climax in the 3rd to 5th years of life, end quote. Oedipal theory reflects Freud's recognition of the psychological, social, and evolutionary implications of this developmental asynchrony. It's this incongruity and the developmental conflicts arising from it, and not paternal aggression, that causes the Oedipus complex and makes it universal. These considerations serve to further clarify the problem with Malinowski's prediction that the Oedipus complex would become extinct with the weak and henpecked father. It assumed that if the average father figure of a given society were benign enough, or psychologically castrated, then the motivation for jealous hostility toward the father due to sexual competition for the mother's sole affections would be eliminated. As we've seen, even logically, this makes no sense. The arousal of such hostility requires nothing more aggressive or violent on the parent's part than the child's exclusion from the mother's bedroom or the parent's bedroom each night, let alone the total exclusion of the child from the mother and her entire village, as in the case of the matrilineal thesis based on the Trogrins. In fact, Malinowski had it exactly backwards. Whereas such a father figure would have little bearing on the actual cause of the Oedipus complex, he would most certainly play a role in its course, intensity, and likelihood of remaining unresolved. Of course, the same would be true in the case of a tyrannical and abusive father. Freudian theory implicates both extremes of overstimulation or indulgence on the one hand, and excessive frustration or trauma on the other, in the wide range of problems that can interfere with a successful resolution of the Oedipus complex. Both extremes can be associated with complications leading to Oedipal and pre-Oedipal fixations or regression. Likewise, both can interfere with latency, and for this reason, an adequate consolidation of sexual role identifications and conscience formation going into puberty. Spiro demonstrated this for the Trobriand boy, who, so far from having no Oedipus complex, retained the unresolved libidinal attachments to the pre-Oedipal and Oedipal mother even more intensely than is likely for the Western type boy. In Trobriand society, the total extrusions from the mother and her village at the time of weaning, and again at puberty, were necessary precisely in order to facilitate the young boy's identification with his collective fathers and the relinquishment of the still powerful early attachment to the Oedipal and pre-Oedipal maternal objects. Freud's recognition of the consequences of prolonged human maturation and dependency provided him with a conceptual link between individual and social psychology and phylogenetic or evolutionary processes. Freud realized that it was because of this feature in the mother-infant relationship that, quote, the influence of the real external world upon the developing infant is intensified, end quote. It was this factor that, quote, establishes the earliest situations of danger and creates the need to be loved, which will accompany the child throughout the rest of his life, or her life. The implications of this for the evolution of social structures was not lost on Freud. Quote, in the prolonged symbiosis of the child with his parents, we have the reason why human beings live in families, and in this prolonged coexistence of two generations, we have the biological basis of social life, end quote. It was on this conceptual foundation that Freud formulated his theory of human culture as a compromise solution to the dynamic conflicts forever arising between the ego and the drives. Quote, and here the discovery, this is Freud, and here the discovery was made that a third and extremely serious part of human intellectual activity, the part which has created the great institutions of religion, law, ethics, and all forms of civic life, has as its fundamental aim of the enabling of the individual to master his Oedipus complex and to divert his libido from its infantile attachments into the social ones that are ultimately desired, end quote. Freud would say also to divert his aggressive instincts. I would argue. Okay, a final irony in Freud's complemental series. The genius of Freud's theoretical integration of individual psychology, social psychology, and evolutionary processes brings us to a final irony. It was because of Freud's grounding in evolutionary biology that critics, ever since Malinowski, have continued to accuse him of postulating a rigid biological determinism or biological reductionism. Yet nowhere is Freud's insistence on the reciprocal interaction of biological inheritance and developmental experience in human adaptation more elegantly on display than when Freud defined the Oedipus complex in relation to the biological fact of prolonged infant dependency. As we've seen, Freud recognized that it was precisely for this reason that an early differentiation between the ego and the id is promoted, quote unquote. A major consequence of this differentiation is the fact that anywhere between 12 and 20 plus years of enculturation, depending on the given society, will be required of the human ego before it can master the simultaneous demands made upon it from both the external environment and the internal drives sufficiently to achieve adult status. It's this distinctive feature of our shared evolutionary heritage and developmental biology that ensures from the beginning to the end of life the role of learning, culture, and adaptation in all human motivation. And it's this differentiation between the ego and the id and the normal developmental conflicts arising from it that causes the Oedipus complex and makes it universal. So we can summarize these considerations by saying that prolonged childhood helplessness and dependency is a cross-culturally universal fact among humans. This fact is a function of our shared evolutionary heritage as a species. Equally cross-cultural is the fact that roughly between 2 to 5 years of age, long before physical maturity and independence is attained, libidinal attachment to the primary caregiver or caregivers will become inflected through the prism of genitally dominated, object-related impulses, perceptions, and fantasies. The dawning recognition at this unique moment of development, as Green would put it, quote, that the young baby and its mother are not alone in the world, and that the object, being the mother, has its own object, which is not the baby, end quote, triggers an inevitable and more or less painful narcissistic crisis in all of us. The normal developmental conflict, or set of conflicts that flow from this crisis, is what Freud called the Oedipus complex. The achievement among our proto-human ancestors of a means of resolving this Oedipus complex, this crisis, was in Freud's estimation as monumental an event for human evolution as it is for each person's individual development. It's only too easy to forget that Freud's most controversial conclusion in Totem and Taboo was not that all children experience destructive and incestuous wishes in the Oedipal triangle, or even that the primal deed, either fantasized or real, had occurred. Rather, it was Freud's assertion that the distinctly human means of resolving the Oedipus complex in both its intrapsychic and cultural dimensions recapitulates primal adaptations made and preserved by some as yet incompletely understood mechanisms of inheritance. A central theme of these lectures is that Freud's explanation of this human innovation and the inheritance of it, and however we mean that, can only be appreciated in the context of his ideological formula of the reciprocal interaction of innate and acquired factors operating in human ontogeny and phylogeny, development and evolution, otherwise known as the complemental series. Finally, as Oedipal conflicts must be accounted for regardless of society or culture, they must also be accounted for regardless of sex. Much has been written and debated concerning the profound and important differences between the female and the male Oedipus complexes. I would argue that these differences were always the more important and fruitful subject for psychoanalysis to grapple with, far more than the question of a non-Oedipal nuclear complex. It certainly was for Freud. He grappled a great deal with this question and altered his theory over time to account for it. He also acknowledged his limitations with regard to this subject and recognized the necessary role of women psychoanalysts in answering it. For better or worse, however, the historic controversy that emerged between anthropology and psychoanalysis was not about these differences. nor was it about their profound effects in the adult lives of women and men. The crux of the controversy, rather, was the question of whether or not the Oedipus complex existed, specifically whether it existed in non-Western matrilineal societies. Malinowski's answer was no, even though he agreed that Freud's Oedipal theory was an accurate analysis of the European or Western type nuclear complex. To this extent, Malinowski's own thesis remains at odds with the more radical rejections of Oedipal theory in contemporary psychoanalysis and the postmodern rejection of nomothetic or generalizable models altogether. It's in large part these latter trends in psychoanalysis and their historical connections with Malinowski's Sex and Repression in Savage Society from 1927 that the present lecture has attempted to address. The guiding assumption here is that an understanding of the evolutionary bases for Oedipal conflicts serves the question of their different manifestations according to sex and a multitude of other variables. Radical versions of cultural determinism would preempt this complemental approach with the claim that sexual differences are purely cultural constructions. Equally extreme versions of biological determinism would also preempt it and the possibility of a psychoanalytically informed critical theory, one which takes into account the role of environmental forces in structuring apperception. This, I would argue, describes Freud's theory. By definition, both effectively eliminate Freud's ideological formula of the complemental series. For the same reason, both extremes preempt a balanced understanding of the cross-culturally variable but universally recognized boundaries that differentiate the generations, adult from child, and the sexes, male from female. The social structuring of these boundaries, the social cultural construction of these boundaries, along with those defining exogamous groups, is the collective equivalent of the resolution of the Oedipus complex. Paradoxically, while it was Freud who insisted on the biological fact, quote, the biological fact of the duality of the sexes, end quote, it was also Freud who confronted our simplistic assumptions about these boundaries, asserting that no individual is limited to the modes of reaction of a single sex, end quote, and that, quote, psychological bisexuality, too, embarrasses all our inquiries into the subject and makes them harder to describe, end quote. So these boundaries are socially constructed, socially structured, but they're universal also. They're universally recognized cross-culturally. And while it took Freud to elucidate the nature of the unconscious forces that drive our creative capacity to transcend boundaries, it was also Freud who described the power of those same forces to undo the boundaries upon which our creativity and culture thrive. While variously drawn, these universal boundaries are the very ones to which every human being must become reconciled in the course of resolving the Oedipus complex and mastering the challenges of life and adult love. Unfortunately, this comes as a painful blow to human narcissism and our childhood fantasies of omnipotence. For this reason, the fragile ego is always ready with new resistances to the recognition and acceptance of these universal boundaries. It's a tribute to the power of such resistances that Klakon's affirmation of the universal culture pattern had to be considered a confession within anthropology 70 years ago, as though he had told an embarrassing secret. It's no small irony that 70 years later, and a century after Freud's Totem and Taboo, This universal cultural pattern is still being treated like an embarrassing secret within psychoanalysis. And that concludes this lecture on the Universal Oedipus Complex.